He has degrees in mathematics and Chinese. How about that? He's a voluntary researcher and presenter for the Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable that does their programs, in case you haven't heard, at the center, the History Center in St. Paul. And Andrew manages the student outreach part of each of the programs, which is an adjunct to the main program. So without further ado, Andrew, you're up.
We actually have one of the 400 or so Medals of Honor awarded during World War II. We have one from St. Paul, who flew for the Marine Corps in the Battle of Midway. And so I'm just here to educate, on who he is, what he did, and what his place in history is now. Because sadly, his Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously, which means he didn't have time to raise a family and grandkids, and wasn't married when he gave his life for freedom and liberty in the Pacific. So if anyone's heard of Richard Eugene Fleming, he's the namesake of Fleming Field in South St. Paul. So, and of course, like Steve said, I also volunteer and research and present for the Student Outreach, which is a supplement to the monthly World War II History Roundtable at the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. And this is one of the presentations I've given in the past when to also serve as the veteran supplement of the night as well. And it's all a team effort. Let's see if I can get this list. And so I would just like to thank Colonel Don Patton, who is the art director, and Steve Anderson, and I also have a colleague named Steve Dobbins-Beck who helps me tremendously with these presentations. And also for this one in particular, St. Thomas Academy, you'll see why, in Fort Snelling National Cemetery, and my dad also is Captain retired Brooksburg from the Navy. So Richard Fleming was born in St. Paul. Also, I'm told you're all welcome to eat cake. I think it's being served, right? Okay, so no one has to get up, but feel free to just chow down on that stuff. It looks really good, so go for it. So anyway, Richard Fleming, born in St. Paul, raised in the residential neighborhoods here. He was back then there was no Interstate 94, so you can picture no highway, just the gridlock of residential St. Paul neighborhoods. He attended the St. Thomas Military Academy, where he graduated in 1935 as the cadet commander, the top student cadet in his class. Richard Fleming had a habit for distinguishing himself, as we'll see. He is a very gifted and intelligent individual with a knack for peer leadership and technical proficiency. And he earned his Bachelor in Arts from the U of M in 1939, where he was in the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, which is still exists today, and it's headquartered on University Avenue. He, like many young men at the time, knew there was trouble brewing in the world, and he must have known that he wanted to be ready in case the imminent conflict reached the United States. He was fascinated with flight, so he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1939, shortly after earning his bachelor's degree. And he was commissioned as a lieutenant. He completed his flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, and there he is in his fraternity photo. And there he is in his Marine dress uniform. He again graduated at the top of his class in flight school at NAS Pensacola. By now it's 1940 and Germany had invaded Poland. They were stopping over the Nazi jackboot-covered Europe, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Low Countries. The United States at this time was increasing its sanctions on Japan, particularly concerning the Emperor's oil supply, and tensions were ramping up. And Lieutenant Fleming's first duty station was Naval Air Base San Diego, where he arrived a month before the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. He was ultimately destined for Midway Atoll, however, and he arrived there with his unit 10 days after the surprise attack that left the U.S. Pacific Fleet in shambles. Fleming was a flight officer in Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241. So keep in mind, if we think of blue planes in the Pacific, this is the Marines, not the Navy. So where do Marines take off from? They take off from islands and aircraft carriers. But his unit in particular was a scout bombing squadron that took off from the island of Midway, the atoll. Over the next 6 months, Fleming acquired the lay of the land or should I say sea, around Midway, flying patrols, analyzing the weather patterns, making landings at day and night on the airstrips. He was promoted to first lieutenant and then captain in very rapid succession, and so by May 1942 he's a captain. No doubt due to his leadership prowess and aircraft navigation skills. He was known by this time for his expert handling of his aircraft and his ability to lead technically and doctrinally sound glide bombing and dive bombing attacks. A little known fact of these Marine scout bomber squadrons at this point in the war is that they did not fly the seemingly ubiquitous Douglas SBD Dauntless, which is without a doubt one of the, if not the most easily recognizable planes associated with the victory in the Pacific. You have to remember this is the Marine Corps, which throughout history always does more with less. And they often operated the rest of the War Department's leftover obsolete weapons and material. His craft was the Vought SB-2U Vindicator. As the Japanese mobile strike force known as the Kido Butai approached Midway in May 1942, this aircraft had already been obsolete for a few years. This was a modest Depression-era airframe that was rolled off the production line as low-wing monoplane strike aircraft were the new thing, replacing biplanes. The total number of Vindicators produced, which was 260, is indicative that this was a pre-war design through and through, not meant for mass production. Also similarly produced in modest isolationist-era numbers was another obsolete airframe, the TBD Devastator, which, along with the Vindicator, were quickly replaced after their demise at Midway. You don't hear a lot about the Vindicator, and you certainly hear about the Devastator because they were never used again after the Battle of Midway. It was underpowered, well below 1,000 horsepower, and its cruising speed of 120 miles an hour only gave it about 100 mile an hour advantage over the ships it was chasing. While performing a dive bomb or glide bomb attack, it could carry one bomb under the center line that was released from a carriage that gave it clearance from its two-bladed propeller. So, for two blades means it's scooping up only two blades worth of air instead of 3 or 4 blades, which we saw by the end of the war. Vindicator pilots and crew begrudgingly called their planes wind indicators, which should say plenty about how they felt about their planes. In anticipation of the attack, Admiral Chester Nimitz packed the Small Island outpost with as many aircraft as he could. 31 PBYs, which is not a small airplane. 17 B-17s, 4 B-26 Marauders, and in addition to that, dozens of strike aircraft like the ones in Captain Fleming's VMSB-241. This was part of the U.S. Navy's preparation for Admiral Yamamoto's final battle that would crush the U.S. Navy once and for all and force the U.S. to sue for peace. Remember, the Japanese strategy was never one of attrition. Once the industrial might of the U.S. caught up to out of the Depression, there was no hope for an island nation like Japan to compete blow for blow with the unlimited manpower and resources of the U.S. Being that Midway is in the Hawaiian Islands, it's kind of like, it's kind of to the U.S. like Iwo Jima is to Japan. This is U.S. soil, it still is. It's an emergency landing strip today, actually, for jetliners passing over the Pacific Ocean. And this is actually the unofficial flag of Midway. It's meant to represent looking out over the lagoon to the coral reef and the ends of the atoll there. A little known fact about Midway itself is that it was actually simultaneously attacked by 2 Japanese destroyers on December 7th, 1941, as the attack on Pearl Harbor was underway. This was part of a larger coordinated strike on all the U.S. naval installations in the Pacific, like Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. And the destroyers were repulsed, actually, and this stands as the first American victory of the war. Today, it's a ETOP runway, which is Emergency Extended Twin Operations runway. Behind me, you'll see what the bases at Midway Atoll looked like, as Captain Fleming would have seen them in November 1941, looking east. It may not appear to be much, but these 2 little islands in this lagoon changed the course of history, and in 7 short months, this would be the scene of a battle after which the Japanese would never return to the offensive. So we set the stage, and now the Japanese have started to bomb Midway. And on June 4th, 1942, U.S. Navy codebreakers had long since broken the Japanese naval code that it was readable and knew the Kido Butai were steaming for Midway. Many of the people in this room here know the story of the Japanese destroyer Arashio and its fateful chase of the USS Nautilus, which ultimately gave the location away of the Kido Butai to the fuel-starved U.S. Navy planes led by Wade McCluskey. What is lesser known, however, is the Marine Corps' contribution to the battle on June 4th. Planes from Fleming's Marine Scout Bomber Squadron took off from Midway amid the chaos to look for the Japanese carriers as well, as successfully found them. Captain Fleming's squadron leader, Marine Corps Major Lofton Henderson, was shot down during the first strike on the Japanese carriers. And who here, raise a show of hands, knows the name Henderson, right?
Henderson Field.
Henderson Field, thank you, Dan. So that was the namesake of the airfield on Guadalcanal, later in August when we invaded Guadalcanal. This put Captain Fleming in charge of the squadron after Henderson was shot down and killed at only 24 years old, which is 2 years younger than me. And look how young I look, right? Few words could describe the weight on Captain Fleming's shoulders as he was charged with leading a group of obsolete 1930s strike planes against the baddest and saltiest pilots and sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Also not a small task was being responsible for shooting the combat air patrol off of Fleming's back, a job that fell on his rear gunner, who was a private first class in the Marine Corps named George A. Toms. Without fear, Fleming and Toms led the 2nd Division of VMSB 241 on a dive bombing attack of the Mikuma, a massive Japanese heavy cruiser. And these slow, underpowered aircraft stood little chance of success in the face of the complement of weaponry that heavy cruiser could fill the air with. And there's an artist's rendition of a Vindicator making a dive bombing attack. In the paint scheme, it would have been in the Battle of Midway. Captain Fleming pitched his lone Vindicator into a 70-degree dive, stretching the SB-2U's airframe to its limit. Captain Fleming dove to an absurd 400 feet off the ground, going straight down before releasing his bomb. At that low of an altitude, he most likely missed the wave tops by mere yards as he then pulled out of his dive. The forces on Fleming and Toms' bodies, let alone their aircraft, are sobering to even imagine the G-forces, when it multiplies your body weight on you. Captain Fleming's bomb hit its target, but it's unclear in historical materials whether the effect of this bomb was catastrophic or not. Most likely wasn't. But it wasn't until Captain Fleming rejoined his formation and landed safely back at Midway that he noticed his wind indicator had been perforated by 179 anti-aircraft rounds. He himself was wounded in 2 places and received medical attention that night. The next day, on June 5th, Captain Richard Fleming awoke after only 4 hours of sleep, likely in pain from his wounds, and was given another mission. This time, his Marine Scout Bomber Squadron was to go back out to the Mikuma and try to sink it. It's not known whether Fleming and Toms took off that day in a fresh Vindicator or if the one that was shot to hell the day before was still flyable, but regardless, the 2 men took to the skies for the final time in the lead of the squadron again. Fleming's plan was a coordinated dive and glide bombing attack that would hopefully split up the target's anti-aircraft defenses and ensure a higher chance of bomb hits. While on approach as part of the glide bombing attack, Fleming's Vindicator was fatally struck by likely a 25mm anti-aircraft round from the heavy cruiser, and it caught fire. But, always leading by example and not one to leave his mission incomplete, Captain Fleming continued on. He must have known that he was about to die. With his last actions on this earth, he released his bomb at an absurd 500 feet above the Mikuma, landing a very near miss and then crashing into the sea. And keep in mind, this is a glide bombing attack, which he's trying to hold his plane level, and he's not coming in, high and fast. He's trying to kind of skim over this battleship. He made it to a height of 500 feet before getting shot down. Behind me here, you'll see an artist's watercolor rendering of Fleming's last actions with his Vindicator on fire and going down above the Makuma. Richard Fleming led by example from the time he was a young adult until the time he took his last breath at the controls of his doomed aircraft. His willingness to attack the enemy even while facing long odds beckons to the excellence that has followed him from St. Thomas Military Academy in St. Paul to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of Midway decimated his squadron. Of 30 aircraft, 23 were lost. 36 airmen were casualties. These men that went down joined their brothers of the Navy torpedo squadrons, who were the only elements of the U.S. strike squadrons to suffer more losses. Fleming's surviving squadron mates never forgot his final actions and recounted them in detail when they landed back at Midway. Through the military channels, Fleming was considered for and then awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His mother received the medal in his place on November 4th, 1942, just 2 days after what would have been his 25th birthday. Fleming's backseater, Private First Class George A. Toms, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously as well. And one of the greatest battles in U.S. military history, the Battle of Midway, was no exception in its volume of sacrifice and proportionate number of awards and medals, many of which were sadly handed out posthumously. And as for the Makuma, the heavy cruiser was finished off by U.S. Navy strike planes on June 6, 1942, resulting in a catastrophic loss of life aboard. And so there's a little bit of controversy around Fleming that he actually crashed into the Makuma. And so I wanted to blow up a real nice high-quality picture of the Makuma moments before it sank. And there's no aircraft parts on it. So there was a pretty large explosion on the Makuma, and it's chalked up to history that was its torpedoes detonating. And that's what a heavy cruiser looks like after its torpedoes detonate on board. So, Richard Fleming's legacy, right? So it's because of Americans like him that we won the war. Ordinary, talented, intelligent, smart men and women who answered the call to defend freedom and liberate the oppressed territories far from their homes. He is one of the early cases we can look to and see bravery and duty exemplified to the highest degree. This is in 1942 still. Tragically, the Allied victory in 1945 had the motif of extreme sacrifice displayed throughout the whole conflict like a severed vein. Richard Fleming's contribution to the victory over evil in the Pacific reverberated throughout the war. Many other examples we can look to for inspiration, like the paratroopers in Normandy of the 502nd, led by Richard Cole, who did a bayonet charge through Purple Heart Lane, if anyone knows that battle. The Marines at Tarawa, who suffered insane casualties to learn tough lessons about island hopping. And the airmen of the 8th Air Force, who in total lost more men in the skies over Europe than all the Marine Corps did during World War II in their campaign to crush the Nazi war effort. And finally, in the same theater as Fleming, the TBD Devastator pilots, who themselves were devastated, but drew the Japanese combat air patrol to low level and unintentionally left the SBD's high-angle approach to the Kido Butai more or less unguarded. Captain Fleming had a destroyer named after him, the USS Fleming, DE-32, during the war, which served with distinction in the Pacific. And today his legacy lives on near the place where he grew up at Fleming Field in South St. Paul. Fleming's love of aviation is preserved with his namesake where engines are heard today. And his gravesite is in Fort Snelling National Cemetery and can be seen by the public today. A little behind, sorry. But there's the plaque at Fleming Field, the Marine Corps, Globe and Eagle, and Anchor. And here's his grave at Fort Snelling. Medal of Honor, Captain, Marine Corps, World War II. And then there's DE-32, USS Fleming. I want to reiterate that men like Richard E. Fleming are the reason we are free today. Men like this only truly die when we stop talking about them. And that is when history is in jeopardy of repeating itself. We cannot minimize the sacrifice undertaken by these men in the name of life, liberty, and the pursuit of all who threaten it. Many of the men lost in the Battle of Midway would be the youngest men in the room here today. And yet the freedom of the world was decided by their actions in the right moments. Thanks, everybody.
Can you talk about the museum at all? Which is an awesome place. Or Kent, you want to do it? Okay.
the Midway Museum you're saying, or
The museum.
which museum?
The CAF museum.
I actually haven't been there yet.
Oh.
Sadly, I haven't lived enough.
I lost my mic.
Here it is.
The Commemorative Air Force has a museum at Fleming Field, and it's housed in hangars that were built in 42, I think, or 41.
38.
One of those.
38, Mark says.
Pardon?
38, Mark says.
38. So if you get a chance to go over there, they restore World War II aircrafts. They've got aircraft over there, a B-25 that's operational. It's I can't say enough. It's a really awesome museum.
They do the hangar dance there too.
Saturdays and Wednesdays.
Yeah, they're open to the public on Saturdays and Wednesdays. We usually end up over there on Wednesdays. Also, we have another author sitting here, John Parshall, who wrote the...
Right there, up on the left.
There it is, Shattered Sword.
Stand up, John.
John, stand up and wave. Anybody have any questions of Andrew? Go ahead.
I wouldn't say so. So the question,
Repeat the question for those of us
Right.
who asked.
so the question was, is it true that the Medal of Honor was awarded to officers only and one enlisted guy? That's not what I've experienced. I mean, Audie Murphy was a sergeant, and there were plenty of other enlisted personnel on Iwo Jima. Even I can think of a few that won the Medal of Honor. I mean, other enlisted personnel. John Basilone, Guadalcanal, was a sergeant. Freddie Williams, you said? Woody Williams, right. So, I mean, sadly, yeah, I mean, George A. Toms, the backseat gunner of Fleming, was given the DFC, but Fleming got the Medal of Honor. And I don't think it has to do with one being an officer, one being enlisted, but it was given in proportionate amounts, I'd say. I mean, I think a fun fact about the Medal of Honor itself, of the 400 or so that were awarded during World War II, 10% of them went to men of the 3rd Infantry Division. Right, and that's the infantry division that Audie Murphy was in. Sure. No worries.
Is John Kramer still here?
He's back here, John.
John, I gotta, just a minute. Could you comment on this a little bit? Medal of Honor?
Thank you, Steve. Yes, the Medal of Honor is awarded irrespective of rank. It's exclusively an award of valor, demonstrating courage, oftentimes saving fellow servicemen, and it's an award, of course, as we all know. It's been awarded since the Civil War and to current times. And the standards have changed a bit. There were some peacetime awards, but now it involves combat situations where there's an extraordinary degree of valor, and invariably it's involves the loss of life of the recipient. More often than not, it's awarded posthumously, as it was to Richard Fleming.
Right, we're talking about a guy whose CO went down the day before, and he stepped up to lead his squadron. And I mean, think big picture about what his little Marine Scout Bomber Squadron was told to do. Is they were, you know, they had no hope with just Vindicators to hold off the Japanese mobile strike force. Right, they were at best a delaying force, along with the other planes that Nimitz packed on those airfields. So for him to get back into his plane after getting his plane turned into Swiss cheese the day before, and to lead the more vulnerable element of his attack that he came up with, and then to ride his plane into the ocean to press home his attack. I mean, that's why he was given the Medal of Honor.
John, tell about your memorial over at the Capitol.
Yes, this past year, the Minnesota Medal of Honor Memorial was dedicated on the Capitol grounds. It's symbolically located at the front entrance to the Capitol grounds at the opposite end of the mall from the Capitol. And there we honor 72 of Minnesota's Medal of Honor recipients. From the Civil War to present day, there have been 72 recipients of that award. Since Vietnam, there's been no award to Minnesota residents of Medal of Honor. And it's a reflecting pool, a water feature that is to be lit at night symbolically of those that served and sacrificed. And it's being expanded to honor by reference to a database that's being established, Minnesota's war debt from the Civil War to present day.
Thank you, John. Any other questions of Andrew? Andrew, thank you very much. That was great.